Are you tired of letting a pawn slip past a rook? In today's video, we're going to discuss rook versus passed pawn positions, how the rook is able to stop the passed pawn with various techniques, and even a rare scenario when a single passed pawn is able to defeat the rook. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. First things first, I want to discuss this position right here, and this is a position where a passed pawn is actually able to beat the rook. So the correct move in this position is to go c7. Now the thing here for the black pieces is that the rook is unable to go to d8. It is also unable to go to c5. Both of these squares are controlled by white. If it goes to d7, we simply just queen. So the only thing black can try to do here is to give a check on d6. Now we have to be careful with white. If we go up in order to support the pawn, we actually blunder a draw, because after rook to d7, the pawn is pinned. Let's say king c6, the rook sacrifices itself for the pawn, and this position is of course a draw, king versus king. So going back, the correct move in this position is king to b5. So we need to go down and we need to make sure that this square is still controlled, and also the c6 square is also controlled. And if the rook goes to d7, the pawn is no longer pinned. So we go king b5. The only thing black rook can do is to give us a check on d5, and we just keep going down here until we get to c2. Now here there is a very special trick. Before we get to that though, we cannot simply just go to c3, or we cannot simply go to c4, because there is this trick with rook d1. I forgot to mention this earlier. There is this trick with rook d1, and if you queen, there is rook c1 skewer, and we simply blunder a draw as the white pieces. So that's also another trick. That's why you have to go down to b4 and not c4. So after king b4, rook d4, king b3, rook d3, king to c2, now there no longer is that trick of the skewer, but there is just this one really pesky move, rook to d4. And after rook to d4, we cannot make a queen. Making a queen actually blunders the game because of rook c4. And now it's a fork, and if we capture the rook, it's a stalemate. This is a very weird position, as you can see. So the correct winning idea here is to make a rook instead. And the thing is, we're threatening checkmate on a8. Rook covers that, and now king to b3 hits the rook, and also threatens checkmate on c1, and this position is completely winning for the white pieces. So as you can see, there can be rare situations when a passed pawn is able to beat the rook, and the rook is simply unable to sacrifice itself for the pawn, so the position is winning for the side that has the passed pawn, although this is quite rare. So principle number one in rook versus passed pawn endgames is going to be to cut the king off, and this is very important. So what happens if we don't cut the king off in this position and we actually play rook to h8? Unfortunately, this blunders a draw, because after both sides, or after black pushes his pawn and white tries to bring the king, what will happen is that we will get into a scenario like this, where the white rook is unable to cut the king off and also protect the pawn at the same time, because if the rook goes back, the king will go back and still escort the pawn. After a check, the king will just simply go back and forth, and if you try to bring the king with king f3, let's say, after h2 you're threatening to queen, and after rook h8, king g1, we simply get a repetition because we're threatening to queen on the next move. If the rook gives a check, again, it is going to be a repetition. So going back, the correct move is actually not rook h8, it is rook to b5. And cutting the king off on the 5th rank works against pretty much any pawn because of a very specific reason, and I will show you what this reason is. First and foremost, if black doesn't do anything, we will simply bring the king. We won't even block the rook here. We will just simply bring the king just like this. We'll bring the king around whichever way you want to. We will scoop up the pawn, and then the rest of the game is going to be very easy. But what black will try to do instead is black will try to push the pawn. So after rook to b5, black will go h4. In this case, once again, we still bring the king. We don't want to do anything else. And if the black pawn continues, or if the black side continues to push the pawn, now he runs into a serious issue, and that is that the king and the pawn are separated by 2 files. This is very important because we can go rook to b3, and the king is too far away to protect the pawn. The pawn has to be pushed. Now we go rook h3, and on the next move, we win the pawn. Okay, now let's talk about the scenarios when the black king is able to save himself despite the fact that the white king is very close. So in this case, black has a pawn that is on the second rank. This pawn is about to promote, and white wants to try to stop this pawn and try to win the game. However, this position specifically is going to be a draw. Now, why is this a draw? After rook to a2 check, the king has to go to e1. Still, the promotion is being threatened. If white plays king to e3, here you cannot promote the pawn. If you to the queen, I should say, you cannot promote to the queen because you get checkmated. So the correct defensive resource here is for black to actually promote to a knight. This is the only way black can draw this game. So after promoting to a knight, the king goes to f3, and the only thing you can do with the black pieces is just go back and forth here. Make sure to keep the knight close to the king, because if the knight and the king get separated, there is a high probability that black will end up in a losing position because the knight will simply be won by the rook and the white king. So you have to keep the king and the knight together here and just simply go back and forth. And if you get the opportunity, also try to bring the king from the edge of the board. So in this case, for example, you would go king f2, you would go king f3, just run out, and this is a much easier draw than staying on the first rank or staying on any edge for that matter. Now let's talk about another scenario which is quite similar, but in this case it's a knight's pawn. In the first situation, let me just go back here, it was a bishop's pawn. Now the knight's pawn is actually easier because after rook to a2, in addition to king f1 and making a knight, this also works, but there's actually another defensive resource, which is king to g1 and then king to h1 running to the corner. Now if the rook gives a check here, we simply queen. This is an easy draw, but if the rook takes the pawn, now it is a stalemate, and this position also ends up being a draw. However, there is one case where the position is not a draw, and that is when it is a rook's pawn. So in this case, after rook to a2 check, king to g1, king to g3. In this case, once again, if we make a queen, white wins because rook a1 is checkmate. However, if we make a knight, it is still lost because after king to f3, black is simply in zugzwang. Both knight moves lose the piece, and if you move the king, you simply get checkmated. It is just zugzwang, and whenever it's a rook's pawn, it doesn't matter that it's on the second rank. If the white king is close, this is going to be winning for the side that has the rook. So principle number 2 is going to be to give intermediate checks in order to win a tempo. So in this position, after king to f2, white has a decision to make. If white plays a natural looking move, which is rook to g8, putting the rook behind the passed pawn, what happens here is that black will simply push the pawn, white will try to bring the king. However, it's not enough because the pawn is a bit too far advanced, and we simply get a repetition here. If we don't get a repetition, then black will queen and the white rook will have to sacrifice itself for the queen. So going back, instead of rook to g8, the correct move here is to give this check on f8. And after rook to f8, black has a decision to make. Black does not want to step in front of the pawn because this just simply doesn't help, because you're still blocking the pawn. You're gonna have to move the king away. So the best move here for the black pieces, or the best try I should say, is to move away from the pawn, such as going to e3. But now we go to g8, and the difference is that now the black king is forced to go to f3 to guard the pawn, and black cannot play g3 right away. This basically wins us one single tempo, one single move, and this is what allows us to win this endgame in this position. So after we bring the king, black pushes the pawn, we give a check one more time, forcing the king either in front of the pawn, in this case we would also bring the king, or we force the king behind the pawn, which it doesn't really matter, or we still bring the king, g2, we go king to f2, king h3, and now this position is simply winning. We can go rook g8 to win the pawn, we can go rook h8 to give a check and then win the pawn. It does not matter what we do, we are simply going to win this pawn and then win the game. So principle number 3 is going to be to shoulder the enemy king away. So in this position, a very natural looking move for the white pieces is to play this move king to b4. However, this actually loses the game for this reason. Black brings the king and white tries to push the pawn. Black keeps bringing the king. Both kings are just simply going up the board. However, at some point after rook to b1 check, white has a decision to make. White either has to go behind the pawn, which is of course losing because king c7, and then this square, the promotion square, is blockaded, and black will simply win the pawn, or you have to go in front of the pawn, which simply blunders checkmate, and you have to be very careful. Like, you will get put in zugzwang here, and then you will get checkmated just like this. So going to the starting position, king to b4 is a huge mistake, but a move that draws the game is king to c4. And after king c4, if black tries to bring the king, it is more difficult because the king on c4 shoulders the black king away, and this one crucial tempo allows white to actually draw the game, because the rook itself is not going to be able to do a lot of damage. White will simply protect the pawn, and after a move like a5, let's say rook to h4, king c5, rook to a4, king b5, rook goes back, white will simply push the pawn, and if you try to bring the king as the black pieces, it's not enough anymore because the king is too far away, and the position will simply end in a perpetual draw. Principle number 4 is going to be to outflank the enemy king. In this position, if white plays the very natural looking move, which is rook to d1, this is actually a blunder for the following reason. After pawn to d4, white goes king to d7. The goal with the white pieces is to bring the king closer to the pawn. However, black stops this by going king d5, let's say king c7, king c5, and black will simply follow the white king. And if white just keeps going back and forth with the king, the game will end up in a perpetual draw. If white tries to give the check, a simple king b4 actually just ends the game right away, because after the king tries to get close, the pawn is too far advanced right now and the king is not in time. The same thing happens on the other side. Let's say, let me just go back to this position right here. If we go to this position and white tries to give the check on e1, exact same thing happens. In this case, we go to f4 and the position ends up being a draw. So that is the problem with playing rook to d1 right away. So just to go back and illustrate, in this position we cannot play rook to d1, but what we can play is this very unorthodox looking move, which is rook to d2. After rook to d2, black should try to push the pawn because there is no other good move other than maybe king to e4, but let's just say d4, right? Very natural looking move, pushing the pawn, trying to advance this pawn. Now we go rook d1. And what we accomplished here is that we did waste a tempo with the white pieces, but we kind of got the opposition, and it is a strange position because it is not a king and pawn endgame, right? It's king and pawn versus king and rook, and opposition here should not really be relevant, but it actually is. After king to e4, let's say, we can outflank the enemy king. We can go king d6 and then king c5. This is not an option that we had earlier, because earlier when we went to d1 right away after d4, if we try to do this, first of all, we cannot go to d6, but if we try to do this by going to d7, the king would follow us. But after rook to d2 and then going back to d1, even though we kind of wasted a tempo, we are able to outflank the enemy king, and our king is actually weirdly in time. By wasting a move, we are actually able to make it to the pawn, and that is why opposition matters so much, and that is why it's so important to outflank the enemy king. So now I want to give you guys a small exercise right here. The position is black to play, and by the way, pawns are going down here since we're looking at the position from white's perspective. So I want you guys to pause the video and put all of the ideas that we talked about together and try to solve this puzzle. I'm gonna give you guys 3, 2, 1. So the solution to this puzzle is this move, rook to b8. This is an incredible move right here. This is the only winning move, and the reason is very specific. First and foremost, what does rook b8 do? It cuts the king off. Now, why do we need to cut the king off? What happens if we go, for example, rook e8? Very natural move. It does attack this pawn. So why can't we play rook to e8, for example? If we play rook to e8, white has a defensive resource here, and that defensive resource is this move king to b5. a4 and then king b5 works also, so there are multiple move orders, but we have to play king b5. And the idea of king b5 is that after we start pushing our a pawn and the black king tries to get close, the problem is the white king is shouldering the black king away and not allowing the black king to advance forward. So that is the reason why we need to play this move, rook to b8. We're cutting the king off and we are not allowing the white king to go to b5. Therefore, the white king will not be able to shoulder the black king away. So let's say in this position, king to a7 is played, attacking the rook. Now we go rook to e8, and let's say white tries to push the pawn. Now we don't even capture this pawn. We don't want to waste any time. Remember, this pawn is going, so we cannot waste any time. We need to bring our king, and we need to keep bringing our king, and eventually what will happen is that king to b7 will be played. We will play king b5, pawn to a7, and now once again we get into this position right here where we can give a check on e7, force the king to b8, and then we can go king to b6. We don't even touch this pawn. This pawn on e6 is completely irrelevant. It's actually a total distraction. And here we know that the only defensive resource for our opponent is to make a knight. We've already talked about this position. Since it is a rook's pawn though, the position is lost. If it was like a knight's pawn, it would be a draw, but it is a rook's pawn. And after king to c6, white is in zugzwang. If king c8 is played, rook e8 is mate. If either of the knight moves are played, both of them lose the knight, and on the next move we will scoop up the pawn just like this. We might not even have to, but just take the pawn for good measure, because why not? And in a couple of moves we will checkmate the white king. So congratulations to everybody who figured this out, because this is a very difficult puzzle. So principle number 5 is going to be, if there are two connected passed pawns in the position, put the rook behind the more advanced passed pawn. So in this case, the black pawns are going down, and the more advanced one out of these two pawns is this f pawn right here. It's the pawn on f3. So in this case, we need to put the rook behind the more advanced passed pawn. So the correct move would be this move, rook to f6. And what this does is that it basically immobilizes these pawns. If the g pawn moves, we take the pawn on f3, and then after g2, rook g3, we will win the g pawn as well. If the f pawn moves, of course, we just simply take the f pawn. However, if we modify the position slightly, let's go to this position right here. Now it is the exact same position actually, but it is black to move, and this leads me to principle number 6. If the two connected passed pawns, let me push the pawn to g3, so we have two connected passed pawns. If they reach the third rank, or for white, that's going to be the 6th rank, the rook can no longer stop them. So in this position, the two pawns have both reached the third rank, therefore they are unstoppable. If we go rook d3, it doesn't matter which pawn you push, the other one, well, that one will simply promote. Even if you try to do the same tactic with, putting the rook behind the more advanced passed pawn, it no longer works because the pawns are a bit too far advanced. So once the pawns get to the third rank, they are simply unstoppable. If for white, if the pawns get to the 6th rank once again. Let me just show you one more position. So in this position, black is completely winning because these two pawns are not on the 6th rank, they're actually on the 5th rank, so we can actually attack them. It doesn't matter which one you attack. You can play rook a2 or you can play rook b2. They're both completely winning. Let's say our opponent pushes b6. Now we would play a move like rook to b5, attacking this pawn. And what's going to happen is that if like king g2 is played, we capture the pawn. Now let's say b7, rook back to b5. We will win the b pawn on the next move, and we will win the game. There is one last scenario that I want to discuss, and that is when the pawns are split apart just like this. So in a position like this, it depends on how far apart they are and how far the kings are. So in this case, the white king is too far away, so it's totally out of the equation, and the black king is actually quite close. So the threat here is that black will play king to f2. This is a huge threat, so that means that we cannot play moves like king to b7, because after king to f2, or let's say rook b1, promotion. If we capture the queen, of course, then black will make a new queen. If we capture the pawn, queen versus rook is a winning endgame for the queen. So going back, we cannot play king to b7 or any king move in general, and we also cannot take the pawn because after b1 we get the same kind of scenario. So in this case, what we need to do is play this move rook to b1, and this actually secures a draw because the king cannot cross the 2nd rank. If the king goes to the 2nd rank, we capture the pawn with a check, and then we're going to sacrifice the rook for the other pawn, and this position is a draw. And if let's say black tries to go king to d3 to try to go king c2 and win the game this way, we will simply go back. Let's say black goes back, we also go back, black goes back. If at any point black crosses the 2nd rank, we capture the pawn, and then we capture the other pawn. Actually, king e2 is losing because the king cannot defend the pawn. This would actually be winning for white. But in this case, with this sort of a position, it would end in a perpetual draw. King d3, and then rook is on b1, rook will go to g1, king e3, etc. However, if the pawns are separated by only 3 files, so in this case they're separated by 4, so this is a draw. If they're separated by 3 files only, this position simply ends in a win for black, because in this case you simply cannot stop either king f2 or king d2. Well, if you if you capture, c1 promotes, but if you go to this side, king d2 comes, and then you cannot do anything because black queens on the next move. So I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Check out my other rook endgame videos and my endgame series in general, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.